My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know
Headlines about a secret midnight meeting, a sealed crimson dispatch, and a dramatic showdown at a royal banquet have been circulating online, claiming King Charles has quietly handed Princess in full palace authority. It makes for a gripping thumbnail. It is also not supported by any credible reporting. There is no verified account of a confrontation between Princess and Queen Camilla, no leaked palace document, and no evidence that Charles has transferred sweeping new powers to his sister in secret. What is true, however, is arguably more interesting than the invented version. Princess genuinely does hold a formal constitutional role that allows her to act on the king's behalf. She genuinely has become one of the most active working royals during her brother's cancer treatment. And the bond between Charles and Anne, built over more than 70 years, is well documented in royal history without needing any embellishment. This is that story told through what has actually been reported, recorded in Parliament, and confirmed by the palace itself. To understand its actual authority, you have to start with a piece of legislation most people have never heard of, the Regency Act 1937, later amended by the Regency Acts of 1943 and 1953. This law created the position of Counselor of State, a role that allows a small group of senior royals to carry out most of the sovereign's official duties whenever the monarch is unavailable, whether through illness or travel abroad. Counselors of State can attend Privy Council meetings, sign routine state documents, and receive the credentials of new ambassadors. What they cannot do is touch the handful of powers considered too significant to delegate, most notably dissolving Parliament or granting certain honors tied directly to the monarch's personal judgment. Under the original law, the pool of eligible counselors was fixed, the monarch's spouse, plus the next 4 adults in the line of succession over the age of 21. For years, that meant the list was largely locked in place by birth order, rather than by who was actually doing the work of a modern working royal. That became a real problem after Queen Elizabeth II's death. By late 2022, 2 of the 5 people technically eligible to stand in for King Charles were Prince Andrew, who had already withdrawn from public duties over his association with Jeffrey Epstein, and Prince Harry, who had relocated to the United States and stepped back as a working royal. Neither was in a realistic position to perform official state functions on the king's behalf. So Charles did something almost unheard of. He asked Parliament to change the law. In a formal message read to the House of Lords in November 2022, the king requested that his sister and his younger brother, Prince Edward, be added to the list of counselors of state, specifically citing that both had already handled the role before. Parliament agreed, and the Counselors of State Act 2022 received royal assent that December, permanently adding Princess and Prince Edward alongside the existing counselors. This wasn't a secret midnight decision. It happened in full view of Parliament, was covered by the BBC and other outlets at the time, and is now written into UK law. It is also not new authority invented for a health crisis. It is a standing arrangement that has existed for years and simply reflects who among the senior royals is actually able and willing to do the job. If Anne's constitutional role explains what she is legally permitted to do, her personal record explains why the king trusts her to do it. For most of the past 2 decades, Princess has topped or nearly topped the annual list of royal engagements compiled from the court circular, the official daily record of royal activities. She carried out 433 engagements in 2023 and 457 in 2024, claiming the title of hardest-working royal in both years despite sustaining a concussion after being kicked by a horse during a 2024 visit to France, an injury serious enough to require hospitalization. She still finished the year at the top of the list. In 2025, her total rose again to 478 engagements, a 10% increase from the year before. For the first time since 2022, however, she was edged out of the top spot, this time by her own brother, who logged more than 530 engagements that year as he balanced his cancer treatment with what one royal commentator called an almost defiant return to a full public schedule. Anne's commitment to public duty long predates her brother's reign. She undertook her first official engagement in 1969 at 18 years old and has carried out more than 20,000 royal engagements since. She became president of Save the Children UK in 1970 and has remained closely associated with the charity for decades, traveling to some of the organization's most difficult field locations. She currently serves as patron or president of hundreds of organizations, ranging from the Riding for the Disabled Association to the Carers Trust, where she took over as patron for unpaid caregivers across the country. In a public statement at the start of 2026, she praised carers as, in her words, the backbone of society and highlighted that the charity had supported more than 1.1 million unpaid caregivers in 2025 alone. This is the practical foundation beneath her formal title. Being a counselor of state on paper matters far less than being someone who reliably shows up, and by that measure Anne's track record is essentially unmatched among her generation of royals. Charles was born in November 1948 and then followed less than 2 years later, in August 1950. That narrow gap made them each other's closest companions during a childhood defined by formality, staff, and near-constant public attention. Royal biographers have long described the two as temperamentally different but personally close, Charles more sensitive and reflective, and more direct and unsentimental. One of the more widely documented episodes of their early bond involves Gordonstown, the strict Scottish boarding school their father insisted Charles attend. Charles has spoken candidly in later interviews about how unhappy he was there, and multiple royal biographies describe and as one of the few people in whom he confided during those years. Their relationship continued through some of the family's most difficult public chapters, including the well-documented breakdown of Charles's marriage to Diana, Princess of Wales, during the 1980s and 1990s, and largely avoided commenting publicly on the situation, a pattern consistent with her long-standing reputation for staying out of tabloid controversy, even as other family members became fixtures of it. As in his words, a personal blessing, while crediting early diagnosis and adherence to medical advice. The palace has been careful, however, not to describe this as remission, and the specific type of cancer has never been publicly disclosed. In practical terms, this means Charles has continued to carry out a full public schedule throughout his treatment, including high-profile state visits, but has occasionally needed to scale back or delegate certain engagements. And along with other senior working royals including Queen Camilla and Prince Edward, has stepped in on his behalf during periods when his medical care took priority. This is precisely the situation the Counselors of State framework was designed for, not a permanent handover of power, but a mechanism to keep official state business running when the monarch cannot personally attend to it. Royal commentators have repeatedly pointed to this dynamic as evidence of Anne's importance to the institution as a whole, not because she is angling for greater influence, but because her steady, low-drama public record makes her a natural person to rely on. One royal expert described her as offering the king grounded, sometimes contrarian advice, precisely the kind of perspective a monarch surrounded largely by advisors and officials might otherwise lack. It's worth being clear about the limits here as well. Princess Anne will never become monarch. Long before her mother's death, the modern rules of succession made clear that the crown passes through the male preference system that applied to her generation, meaning the throne went to Charles as the elder sibling, regardless of Anne's work ethic or public standing. This isn't a controversial or contested point. It's simply how hereditary succession under the relevant legislation has always worked for her specific birth year, since the change to absolute primogeniture introduced in 2013 only applies to those born after that reform. What she has inherited, in a more limited and practical sense, involves her own household and property rather than the monarchy itself. Gatcombe Park, the roughly 730-acre Gloucestershire estate purchased by Queen Elizabeth II in 1976, has been Anne's home for decades and is where her children, Zara Tyndall and Peter Phillips, and their families have also lived. Neither of Anne's children holds a royal title or carries out official royal duties, a deliberate choice Anne and her first husband made when the children were born. Because Gatcombe Park sits outside the Crown Estate and outside the sovereign grant system that funds working royals' official duties, questions about its future occasionally surface in royal commentary, particularly around how UK inheritance tax would apply to a private estate of that size. It's worth explaining those rules accurately, since they're often misrepresented. Under current UK law, inheritance tax is charged at 40% on the portion of an estate that exceeds the nil rate band, a tax-free threshold of £325,000 per individual. On top of that, there is a residence nil rate band, an additional allowance available when a home is passed to direct descendants such as children or grandchildren, which can add a further allowance on top of the standard threshold, though it tapers away for larger estates. Several standard mechanisms exist to reduce inheritance tax liability on high-value estates, and any family managing significant property would typically use one or more of them. The spousal exemption is the most straightforward. Assets left to a spouse or civil partner are exempt from inheritance tax entirely, regardless of value, and any unused portion of the deceased spouse's nil rate band can be transferred to the surviving spouse, effectively doubling their own allowance later. Lifetime gifting is another common approach. Gifts made more than 7 years before the donor's death fall outside the estate entirely for inheritance tax purposes, which is why wealthy families often begin transferring property or assets to the next generation well in advance rather than waiting until death. Trusts offer a further layer of planning. Placing property into a discretionary trust can remove it from an individual's estate for tax purposes, while still allowing flexibility over how and when beneficiaries receive it, though trusts carry their own tax rules and are not a simple workaround. Finally, agricultural property relief can reduce or eliminate inheritance tax on land actively used for farming, which is relevant to any large rural estate, though it comes with specific conditions about how the land is used and by whom. None of this is unique or secret information about the royal family specifically. These are standard estate planning tools available to any UK taxpayer with. More recently, Anne and Charles have appeared together at major state occasions since their mother's death, including walking side by side during the Queen's funeral procession in September 2022 and at King Charles's coronation the following May, wherein rode on horseback in the historic role of gold stick in waiting, a ceremonial position dating back centuries, escorting her brother through London alongside members of the armed forces. None of this requires exaggeration to be a meaningful story. A brother and sister who spent an unusual childhood largely in each other's company, who supported one another through public scandal and family loss, and who now occupy formal roles in the same institution, is a real and well-sourced relationship. It does not need an invented banquet confrontation to be compelling. The most significant recent development in Anne's role is not some secret transfer of power, but something the palace has been quite open about. Her increased visibility since Charles's cancer diagnosis was announced in February 2024. According to the palace's own public statements, doctors moved Charles's treatment into what was described as a precautionary phase heading into 2026, following a health update the king delivered personally in a video message in December 2025. He described being able to reduce the frequency of his treatment. More recently, Anne and Charles have appeared together at major state occasions since their mother's death, including walking side by side during the Queen's funeral procession in September 2022 and at King Charles's coronation the following May, wherein rode on horseback in the historic role of gold stick in waiting, a ceremonial position dating back centuries, escorting her brother through London alongside members of the armed forces. None of this requires exaggeration to be a meaningful story. A brother and sister who spent an unusual childhood largely in each other's company, who supported one another through public scandal and family loss, and who now occupy formal roles in the same institution, is a real and well-sourced relationship. It does not need an invented banquet confrontation to be compelling. The most significant recent development in Anne's role is not some secret transfer of power, but something the palace has been quite open about. Her increased visibility since Charles's cancer diagnosis was announced in February 2024. According to the palace's own public statements, doctors moved Charles's treatment into what was described as a precautionary phase heading into 2026, following a health update the king delivered personally in a video message in December 2025. He described being able to reduce the frequency of his treatment.